I stood in the circular driveway of a massive $5 million estate in Greenwich, watching my sister Victoria greet guests with a fake diamond-bright smile. I am Mallory, a 32-year-old financial analyst who has always preferred the quiet stability of numbers over the loud pretension of high society. My presence at this housewarming party was supposed to be a celebration of family success, yet the moment I stepped into the marble foyer, Victoria blocked my path with a cold stare that felt like a physical barrier. She didn't offer a hug or even a polite greeting, instead, reaching behind a decorative pillar to grab a folded piece of gray fabric. Before I could say a word, she threw a heavy service apron directly at my chest, while a group of her wealthy business associates watched with confused expressions. She leaned in close, her voice dripping with a forced sweetness that couldn't hide the underlying malice, as she reminded me of the so-called sacrifices she made for my education years ago. Victoria told me that since I supposedly owed her my entire career, I would spend the evening serving drinks and cleaning up after her prestigious guests to finally begin paying back that debt. I didn't argue or show the slightest hint of anger, simply unfolding the apron and tying it around my waist with a calm smile that seemed to flicker with a secret she couldn't yet perceive. My sister looked satisfied as she turned away to boast about her new life, but what Victoria didn't know was that this house was never truly hers. If you want to see how this entitlement leads to an absolute downfall and learn the truth about who really owns this mansion, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the shocking conclusion of this family drama. The party was in full swing by late afternoon, and I found myself moving between groups of strangers with a heavy silver tray of appetizers. Every time I passed a circle of wealthy guests, I could hear Victoria loudly narrating a fictional version of our family history. She told anyone who would listen that I was a struggling soul who had failed to find my footing in the professional world after college. Victoria painted herself as the benevolent savior who had opened her home to a sister who would otherwise be wandering the streets without a penny to her name. It was difficult to keep my expression neutral while she described my supposed unemployment as a burden she was happy to shoulder out of pure sisterly love. My husband Grant stood near the mahogany bar and watched the entire display with a jaw so tight I thought his teeth might break. He had been my rock through years of corporate battles, so seeing me treated like a common servant in this house was clearly testing his legendary patience. Grant made a move toward me as I approached the kitchen to refill a tray of champagne flutes, his hand instinctively reaching for the thick legal folder tucked inside his blazer pocket. I caught his eye and gave a subtle but firm shake of my head to signal that the time for our revelation had not yet arrived. He stopped in his tracks, though I saw his fingers tighten around that folder, while he took a long, steady breath to regain his composure. The tension in the room escalated when Victoria suddenly called out my name from across the marble hallway, her voice sharp enough to cut through the soft jazz music playing in the background. She was standing next to a man she introduced as her most important investor, pointing toward a small scuff mark on her expensive designer shoes. Victoria didn't ask for help politely. Instead, she commanded me to kneel down right there in front of everyone to buff out the mark with a silk napkin. I felt the collective gaze of the room fall on me while she explained to her investor that I was simply happy to be useful for once in my life. I lowered myself to the floor without a word of protest, focusing on the rhythmic movement of my hand, while Victoria laughed at a joke I couldn't hear. As I moved through the formal dining room later that hour, the familiar grain of the massive oak table caught my eye and sent a chill through my veins. This was not a piece of furniture Victoria had purchased with her own earnings, because I recognized the unique carved pattern on the legs from my own private storage unit. I began looking around the room with fresh eyes, realizing that at least half of the high-end decor had been taken from my personal collection without permission. The silver candle holders, the hand-woven Persian rug, and even the crystal decanters were all items I had carefully curated over the last decade of my career. Victoria hadn't just stolen my family's trust fund, she had physically raided my life to furnish a stage for her grand performance of success. During a brief moment of solitude in the pantry, I pulled my phone from the pocket of the gray apron to check the status of a specific digital file. I wasn't looking for social media updates or messages from friends, but rather for a scheduled confirmation from my legal team regarding a pending investigation. The screen flickered to life, showing a notification that the final pieces of evidence had been successfully uploaded to the state auditor's secure portal. Everything was moving according to the timeline we had established weeks ago, ensuring that Victoria's house of cards would collapse under its own weight soon enough. I slid the device back into my pocket, feeling a cold sense of justice replace the exhaustion that had been building in my legs all afternoon. Victoria appeared in the doorway of the pantry a second later, her eyes narrowing as she accused me of hiding away from my responsibilities as the evening's help. She warned me that if I didn't perform perfectly for the rest of the night, she would tell our parents that I had been disrespectful to her guests. I simply adjusted the silver tray on my shoulder and walked past her without giving her the satisfaction of a verbal reaction. The weight of the tray felt lighter now that I knew the truth about the furniture surrounding us and the fraudulent foundation of her newfound wealth. My silence was not a sign of submission, but a deliberate choice to let her enjoy the very last hours of her stolen empire before the light of day exposed everything. By 3 o'clock, the heat of the afternoon began to settle over the patio where Victoria was holding court near the infinity pool. I was struggling to keep up with the demands of the guests when Victoria pulled me aside with a look of intense frustration visible on her face. She informed me that I needed to head into the kitchen immediately to prepare several large platters of hors d'oeuvres by myself. Victoria explained that she had dismissed most of the professional catering staff early to save on unnecessary expenses for the rest of the evening. It was clear to me that her desire to appear wealthy was constantly clashing with the reality of her dwindling bank account. I didn't offer any resistance as I walked toward the back entrance of the mansion to begin the solitary task of food preparation. The kitchen was a mess of half-finished plates and discarded garnishes that had been left behind by the departing workers. While searching for a clean tray in the lower cabinets, I accidentally knocked over a heavy decorative vase sitting on the granite countertop. Several envelopes that had been hidden behind the vase scattered across the floor right at my feet. I picked them up and noticed they were multiple overdue mortgage notices, along with several final legal warnings from various credit agencies. The documents revealed that Victoria was actually months behind on her payments and was facing a total financial collapse. This beautiful estate was nothing more than an expensive stage set for a woman who was drowning in a sea of massive debt. The realization that my sister was standing on the very brink of bankruptcy made the weight of the silver tray feel significantly lighter. I spent the next hour working in silence while carefully considering how these new pieces of evidence would fit into my overall plan for justice. Victoria suddenly burst into the kitchen with her face flushed red from both the heat of the afternoon and her own growing anger. She began shouting about how slowly I was moving and accused me of trying to ruin her reputation in front of her prestigious friends. Victoria leaned over the center island and threatened to have me removed from the family circle if I didn't start acting like a grateful servant. I remained perfectly still while her voice echoed off the white tile walls, my hand secretly reaching for the recording device hidden in the pocket of my apron. I looked directly into her eyes and asked her if she truly believed she could keep up this elaborate charade forever with someone else's money. Victoria laughed nervously before admitting that she had indeed taken control of my trust fund to secure the initial down payment for this property. She claimed that she deserved the money more than I did because she knew how to use it to gain influence and social standing. I took what was mine, Mallory. You were always too weak to handle this lifestyle anyway, she hissed while pointing a finger at my chest. I made sure to capture every single word of her arrogant confession on the digital recorder while she continued to berate my lack of ambition. Victoria didn't realize that she had just handed me the final weapon I needed to dismantle her entire life in front of the world. The sound of more guests arriving at the front door forced her to straighten her dress and regain her mask of perfect composure. She ordered me to finish the remaining food platters within 10 minutes or face even more severe consequences from our parents later tonight. I watched her walk back toward the patio with a renewed sense of confidence that was entirely unearned and dangerously misplaced. The kitchen felt strangely quiet after her departure, allowing me to focus on the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock. I carefully tucked the overdue notices back into their hiding place before returning to the task of arranging the expensive appetizers for the next round of service. Every action I took from that moment on was fueled by the knowledge that the foundation of her empire was already crumbling into dust. At 4 o'clock, my parents Thomas and Martha arrived at the estate looking like they had just stepped out of a luxury magazine. I watched from the edge of the patio as Martha immediately rushed toward Victoria, with open arms, completely ignoring my presence as she began praising the sheer scale of the new house. Victoria accepted the adoration with a smug expression, glancing over at me to ensure I was witnessing her moment of total parental approval. Martha didn't even look in my direction until Victoria pointed out that I was the one responsible for the catering delays earlier in the afternoon. My mother finally turned toward me, but her eyes were filled with disappointment rather than the warmth she had just shown my sister. Martha began scolding me in front of several guests, stating that my choice to wear a stained service apron was a deliberate attempt to embarrass Victoria on such an important day. She whispered harshly that I should have at least tried to look presentable, instead of acting like a bitter servant who was jealous of her sister's massive success. I kept my head down and adjusted the heavy silver tray in my hands, choosing not to explain that Victoria had forced the apron on me the moment I arrived. Victoria added fuel to the fire by telling Martha that she was only trying to help me develop a work ethic by giving me these small tasks. My mother nodded in agreement, telling Victoria she was far too kind for putting up with my supposed laziness for this long. While Martha was busy admiring the gold leaf molding in the grand foyer, my father Thomas stood back and observed the interaction with a thoughtful, quiet intensity. He had listened to Victoria's elaborate story about how she had secured the funding for this estate through a series of brilliant international business investments. Thomas seemed to notice the inconsistencies in her narrative, especially when she struggled to name the specific firms she had allegedly partnered with over the last year. I could see the gears turning in his head as he looked from Victoria's expensive jewelry to the exhausted slump of my shoulders. He chose to remain silent for the time being, but his gaze followed me every time I moved through the room to refill a guest's champagne glass. Victoria noticed that she had Martha's full support and decided to push her authority even further by making more unreasonable demands in front of our parents. She ordered me to stop serving the general crowd and focus entirely on providing private service to her inner circle of wealthy socialite friends. Victoria spoke to me as if I were a stranger she had hired off the street, using a tone that was designed to remind everyone of our vastly different social standings. She commanded me to stand by the velvet sofa and anticipate every single need her friends might have without being asked twice. Martha encouraged this behavior, telling me that I should be grateful for the opportunity to see how successful people actually conducted themselves in high society. I felt the immense weight of the appetizer tray straining my muscles, but I continued to perform my duties with a robotic level of efficiency that seemed to bother Thomas. He watched me navigate the crowded room, his eyes lingering on the way I meticulously handled the expensive crystal without ever making eye contact with the people I was serving. Every time our eyes met, I saw a flicker of profound concern behind his glasses that suggested he was finally beginning to see through the golden facade Victoria had built. Despite his growing suspicion, Thomas didn't intervene when Victoria snapped her fingers to demand I fetch a fresh bottle of sparkling water from the cellar. He simply stood there as a silent witness to the psychological warfare my sister was waging against me under the guise of a celebration. The afternoon sun began to cast long shadows across the marble floors, signaling that the party was entering its most expensive and high-stakes phase. Victoria continued to parade Martha around the property, showing off features of the house that I knew for a fact were currently under legal dispute with the bank. I followed them at a respectful distance, carrying a heavy tray of imported cheeses, while Victoria lied about the cost of the custom-made chandeliers hanging above our heads. The contrast between her arrogant laughter and the silent, analytical gaze of my father created an atmosphere that was thick with unspoken truths. I knew that the silence Thomas was maintaining wouldn't last forever, but for now it served as the perfect backdrop for the storm that was slowly gathering outside the estate's tall iron gates. 5 o'clock brought a shift in the wind as Thomas pulled me into the library away from the noise of the party. The room felt strangely quiet compared to the loud laughter echoing from the patio where Victoria was still celebrating her fake success. Dad reached into his jacket and pulled out a heavy document he had discovered by accident while looking for a pen in Victoria's private office. He handed the papers to me with a trembling hand, his eyes searching my face for an explanation that he was clearly afraid to hear. I looked down at the family trust fund statement and felt my heart drop as I saw the massive withdrawals that had drained the entire account over the past 6 months. The bottom of the final page contained a signature that was supposed to be mine, but the handwriting was a clumsy imitation of my legal name. I pointed to the forged signature and told Dad that I had never authorized a single cent to be moved from that secure account for any reason. Every penny of my inheritance had been stolen to provide the cash for the down payment on this massive estate and the expensive decor surrounding us. Victoria had systematically robbed my future while pretending to be the successful business mogul our parents so desperately wanted her to be. Dad stood there in stunned silence, his face turning a pale shade of gray as the reality of his favorite daughter's betrayal began to sink in. He realized that the daughter he had been so proud of was nothing more than a common thief who had preyed on her own family. The heavy library doors suddenly swung open and Victoria burst into the room with her face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She didn't offer an apology or an explanation. Instead, she lunged forward to snatch the documents right out of my father's unsuspecting hands. Victoria turned toward me and began shouting that I was a bitter loser who was intentionally trying to poison Dad's mind against her. She claimed that I was jealous of her achievements and was making up lies about the trust fund to distract everyone from my own professional failures. I remained calm as she crumpled the papers in her fist, watching her struggle to maintain the crumbling facade of her perfect life. Mom heard the commotion and ran into the room, immediately moving to stand by Victoria's side, as if she were protecting a victim from an attacker. Martha didn't even ask to see the evidence before she started lecturing me about the importance of family loyalty and sisterly support. She told me that even if Victoria had moved some money around, I should be grateful that she was managing it for the benefit of the entire family. My mother believed that my sister's social status was far more important than the legal rights I had over my own financial future. She looked at me with a cold glare and told me that I was being incredibly selfish for bringing up such petty matters during a housewarming celebration. Victoria felt emboldened by my mother's blind support and took a step toward me with a smug, triumphant grin on her face. She told Dad that the money was being put to much better use here in Greenwich than it ever would have been sitting in a stagnant bank account. Victoria assumed that because she had Mom on her side, she could continue to bully me into silence as she had done since we were children. I looked directly into her eyes and realized that she felt no remorse for the theft or the psychological damage she had caused. The room was thick with the tension of decades of favoritism and hidden resentment that was finally reaching its breaking point. I straightened my shoulders and looked past Victoria toward the open door where I could see Grant waiting for my final signal. I told my sister that she had underestimated my resolve and the extent of the evidence I had been gathering against her over the past few months. My voice was steady and devoid of the fear she expected as I prepared to move the conversation from private family drama to a legal reality. I looked at the stolen furniture and the expensive chandeliers one last time before turning my focus back to her arrogant face. This wasn't just theft, it was something much bigger, I said with a finality that made Victoria's smug expression finally begin to falter. 6 o'clock arrived with the clinking of champagne glasses as the main toast was announced in the grand ballroom. Victoria stood on the elevated marble dais looking out over the sea of wealthy faces with a triumphant expression that suggested she owned the entire world. She raised her crystal flute high and began a long speech about how hard work and family values had led her to this moment of absolute success. After thanking her business partners, Victoria pointed a finger directly at me as I stood near the refreshment table with my heavy tray. She loudly called me to the front of the room, claiming she wanted everyone to witness her sisterly kindness towards someone who had failed so miserably in life. The guests turned to stare as I walked slowly toward the stage, my head held high, despite the stained apron tied around my waist. Victoria waited until I reached the base of the stairs before leaning down with a cruel glint in her eyes that only I could see. Without warning, she tilted her glass and poured the sticky red wine directly over my head, watching it soak into my hair and drip onto my shoulders. The crowd gasped in shock, but Victoria simply laughed and told me to use my apron to clean up the mess I was making on her expensive floors. She claimed it was a lesson in humility, telling the audience that I needed to learn my place before I could ever hope to achieve anything of value. My mother Martha watched from the front row with a small smile of approval, while my father Thomas looked away in deep embarrassment. I reached up to wipe a drop of wine from my cheek and realized that I no longer felt even a single spark of anger toward my sister. I reached behind my back to untie the knots of the heavy service apron, pulling it off and throwing the dirty fabric directly onto the white marble floor. Victoria's laughter died in her throat when she saw the calm, focused expression on my face that replaced my previous mask of quiet submission. The grand ballroom fell into a terrifying silence as the guests realized that the power dynamic in the room had shifted in a single heartbeat. I stepped over the ruined apron and looked up at my sister with a level of confidence that seemed to physically push her back a step. Grant stepped out from behind a group of investors at that exact moment, walking toward me with a bright red legal folder held firmly in his hand. He didn't say a word as he handed me the documents, but the supportive squeeze he gave my arm told me that everything was ready for the final act. I took a deep breath and opened the folder, revealing the official court orders and the results of the forensic audit we had conducted in secret. Victoria tried to grab the papers from my hand, but I pulled them back and held them up for everyone in the front row to clearly see. The dramatic roleplay of the humble servant was officially over, replaced by the reality of a woman who was about to reclaim her life. I looked at the shocked faces of the guests and then turned my full attention back to Victoria, whose face was rapidly losing all of its color. I announced to the room that Victoria had no legal right to order anyone around in this house, nor did she have any legitimate claim to the wealth she was currently flaunting. The silence was so thick that I could hear the sound of the air conditioning hum against the walls, while Victoria struggled to find her voice. She tried to call for security to have me removed, but none of the staff moved a single inch to follow her increasingly desperate commands. Victoria began to tremble as she realized that her audience was no longer admiring her, but was instead waiting for her inevitable collapse. I took one more step toward her and spoke with a clarity that reached every single corner of the massive ballroom. "The joke is over, Victoria. This house doesn't belong to you, and it never did," I said, while dropping the first page of the legal document right onto her scuffed designer shoes. The guests began to whisper among themselves as they read the heading that identified the property as being held in a disputed trust. Victoria's hands were shaking so violently that she dropped her empty champagne glass, the sound of breaking crystal echoing through the room like a starting gun. I turned my back on her and walked toward my father, knowing that the real investigation was only just beginning. At 7 o'clock, the front doors opened to reveal my lawyer, Mr. Henderson, accompanied by federal financial investigators. The sudden arrival of men in dark suits immediately silenced the remaining music and the whispers of the confused guests. Mr. Henderson walked toward the center of the ballroom with a calm but firm authority that made Victoria freeze where she stood on the dais. He held up a formal notice of seizure announcing to everyone present that the property was being taken into federal custody due to a major financial fraud investigation. Victoria tried to maintain her arrogant posture, but her hands were visibly shaking as she looked at the official government badges being presented. The investigators began to move through the house, systematically placing bright yellow security seals on the expensive pieces of furniture I had recognized earlier. Mr. Henderson explained that the bank had already taken control of the estate, following a series of missed payments and fraudulent loan applications. He stated that Victoria was under investigation for several counts of federal document forgery related to the theft of family trust funds. The luxury lifestyle she had been flaunting for months was exposed as a hollow shell built on a foundation of lies and criminal activity. I stood next to Grant and watched as the investigators began to catalog the stolen artwork and the custom chandeliers that Victoria had claimed to own. It was a cold, clinical process that stripped away the glamour of the evening in a matter of minutes. The shock on the faces of the socialites was profound as they realized they were witnessing a criminal seizure instead of a celebration. I stepped forward to address the room, revealing that I was the one who had initiated the investigation by providing evidence to the authorities months ago. I had spent countless nights gathering the necessary bank statements and tracking the movement of funds from my inheritance into Victoria's personal accounts. It was important for her to understand that her downfall was not an accident, but a calculated response to her years of greed and betrayal. Victoria began to scream, her voice high and desperate, as she turned toward Martha and begged for some kind of intervention or help. She claimed that I was a traitor who was destroying the family's reputation just to satisfy a personal grudge. Martha tried to approach the investigators, but she was quickly intercepted and told that she had no legal standing to interfere with a federal warrant. The investigators ignored the emotional outbursts and continued their work, moving from room to room with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. They began sealing the safe in the office and taking custody of the high-end electronics that had been purchased with stolen money. Victoria's panic increased when she realized that she was not allowed to take anything from the property except for her immediate personal belongings. She looked around at the life she had carefully constructed, seeing only the cold reality of impending legal consequences and social ruin. The crowd of guests began to filter out through the front doors, eager to distance themselves from the scandal that was unfolding in real time. My mother watched them leave with a look of utter disbelief, her dreams of high society status evaporating before her very eyes. Thomas stood near the grand staircase and watched the entire scene with a level of disappointment that was far more powerful than any loud argument. He didn't offer a single word of comfort to Victoria when she fell to her knees and pleaded for him to use his influence to stop the removal. Dad simply looked at the federal agents as they informed Victoria about the pending removal process that would force her out of the house by midnight. He finally realized that his favorite daughter had not only stolen from her sister, but had also put the entire family's name at risk for a fake house. The silence between them was a final acknowledgement that the bond of trust had been broken beyond any hope of repair. He turned his gaze toward me, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of regret and a new quiet respect for my strength. The house felt larger and emptier as the last of the guests disappeared into the cooling night air outside the estate. Mr. Henderson stayed by my side to ensure that all the paperwork was handled correctly while the final seals were placed on the doors. Victoria remained on the floor, surrounded by the ruins of her party and the cold presence of the law. I felt no joy in watching her collapse, but I did feel a profound sense of relief that the truth was finally out in the open. The weight that I had been carrying for years was gone, replaced by the knowledge that justice was finally being served on my own terms. We stood in the center of the stolen ballroom, waiting for the final word that would end this long, exhausting day for good. By 8 o'clock, the lights of the Greenwich estate were dimmed, and the last of the investigators had finished their work. The grand driveway was no longer crowded with luxury vehicles, leaving only a few official cars parked near the iron gates. Victoria and Martha were forced to leave the house immediately, carrying only a few small bags of personal items they had managed to scramble together. My sister's designer dress was wrinkled and stained with the wine she had poured on me just hours earlier, making her look incredibly small against the backdrop of the massive front door. She kept her head down to avoid the harsh glare of the remaining streetlights as she walked toward the exit without her usual entourage of admirers. My mother followed close behind her, clutching a single leather handbag and looking back at the darkened windows of the house she had so desperately wanted to call home. I stood in the center of the foyer, watching the woman who had once been so arrogant tremble as she faced the reality of her legal situation. Victoria tried to fix her hair, but her hands were shaking too violently to manage even the simplest movements of her fingers. She looked at me with a mixture of fear and lingering resentment, knowing that her future was now defined by prison sentences and massive unpaid debts. There was no more social influence to save her, and no more stolen trust funds to buy the silence of her many creditors. I felt a strange sense of closure as I observed her transition from a powerful socialite to a woman with absolutely nothing left to her name. The silence in the house was a reminder that the performance had finally ended and the audience had long since moved on to the next scandal. Martha stopped near the edge of the marble floor and tried to use our shared history to beg for a final moment of forgiveness or mercy. She claimed that we were still a family, despite everything that had happened during this long and painful afternoon of revelations. My mother suggested that I should use my influence with Mr. Henderson to help Victoria avoid the most severe federal charges for the sake of our reputation. I looked at her with a cold, steady gaze and slowly turned my back on her desperate pleas without saying a single word in response. Her voice trailed off as she realized that her manipulation no longer held any power over my decisions or my future. I had spent years being the invisible servant to their greed, but that era of my life was officially over for good. Thomas stepped forward from the shadows of the library and adjusted his coat, his expression firm as he made a final decision about his own path. He informed Victoria and Martha that he was choosing to leave with me, officially cutting off all financial and emotional ties with my sister's criminal activities. Dad handed Victoria a business card for a legal aid office and told her that he would not be paying for any more private defense attorneys. He walked toward the door and placed a supportive hand on my shoulder, signaling that he was ready to start over without the burden of Victoria's lies. Martha cried out in protest, but Thomas didn't even flinch as he guided me toward the car waiting at the end of the driveway. We left them standing on the gravel path, two figures who had traded their integrity for a hollow dream that had finally collapsed. I sat in the passenger seat and watched the massive mansion gates close behind us through the rearview mirror as we drove away. I didn't feel the need to look back at the property or the people who had tried to destroy my sense of self-worth for so long. The road ahead was dark, but I knew exactly where I was going for the first time in many years of wandering. Grant took my hand and squeezed it gently, providing the quiet strength I needed to finally close this chapter of my history. We left the prestige of Greenwich behind us, heading toward a life that was built on something much stronger than stolen money or forged signatures. The cold air coming through the window felt like a fresh start, and I breathed it in with a deep sense of peace that I had finally earned. This journey has taught me that the true value of a person is never found in the grand facades they build or the expensive labels they wear. Justice may move slowly, but it always finds a way to reveal the cracks in a foundation built on lies and the suffering of others. I realized that my silence was not a sign of weakness, but a gathering of strength that allowed me to strike when the truth would have the greatest impact. Standing up for oneself requires more than just anger. It requires the patience to gather evidence and the courage to walk away from toxic family bonds. Wealth can be seized and houses can be lost, but the integrity of your own soul is the only thing that remains entirely within your control. I am no longer a servant to a sister's ego, but the architect of my own honest and independent future. Thank you so much for following Mallory's intense journey for justice against all odds. I hope this story about family secrets and the power of the truth has kept you on the edge of your seat until the very end. What did you think about the way Thomas finally chose a side? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and follow for more gripping dramas.